Hello and welcome to Beecraft Live. My name's Rodri, and as regular viewers will know, I'm a member of the Beecraft team and I'm based in South Wales. We've got our usual team with us this evening. We've got Wendy and Stephen, and we've got a new face as well in the corner, and that's Kevin from France, who some of you may remember from the Asian Hornet special we did last year. Tonight's topic is going to be all about swarming, which I think is very much on everyone's mind at the moment. And I know we've certainly received quite a few questions, so it's going to be an interesting conversation, I think. Here in South Wales, we've had relatively few swarm calls so far this year. I think, as I said last month, the bees seem to be about 4 to 6 weeks behind, and perhaps that sort of caused the delay. But I did have one stack of supers airing in the garden, and a large swarm entered that a few days ago. So that was quite a nice surprise to have. Took a bit of clearing up, but so if we go over to our panel and we'll do the introductions as usual. If you could just say who you are, where you're from, and what your experience is about swarming so far this year. And we'll start ladies first as usual. Wendy, first.
Right, thank you, Roger. Well, actually, I've got very little to report because I've not been aware of any swarms in our area. Having said that, the weather's been so up and down. We've had a huge amount of rain, which has meant we've not been able to get necessarily to all the hives easily. We've had some hot weather, but it's coming in fits and starts. We're back with a bit of drizzle and rain today. So, yeah, it's all very quiet. As far as I've been made aware anyway, and I'm actually not on a swarm call list, so I wouldn't necessarily hear very much. And I forgot to say I'm Wendy, and I'm the marketing side of Beecraft, and I've been keeping bees for, I think it's about 8 years now, so quite surprising how time flies.
So I certainly dread this time of year because I'm on the local swarm collectors list and the phone doesn't stop ringing. So it becomes quite tiresome after a few weeks. But,
yes, it must do.
Over to Stephen.
Okay, I'm Stephen Fleming. I live in the northern part of Hampshire between Basingstoke and Newbury. And normally I would have completed all my splits and everything by this time of year. And frankly, I've only had to do one. Beekeepers always say this, I've never met a year like it. I haven't collected a swarm, I haven't heard about a swarm. As I say, only one colony is split, and remarkably, I've got up to my 5th super on one colony, and I've never been that high before without having to split the colony. So it's a really unusual year, but then every year is unusual, isn't it?
Thinking that's becoming quite common now, isn't it? Changes year on year. And our special guest in the corner, Kevin. Over to you.
Hi, good evening. I'm Kevin, and I live in the Charonne area of southwest France. And we have had some strange weather. 2 years on the trot now here in this part of France, where the winter has not been snap cold, -10, -15 degrees for February, March, and then spring comes like a beautiful light switch. And that is supposed to, in theory, make swarming predictable and manageable. Unfortunately, we had a warm, wet winter, so queens didn't go off late, and the minute they could get out, boy, did they. The numbers of the bees inside the hives has been growing, obviously, during the warmer conditions. Queens have been on lay, and this happened pretty much exactly the same time last year. So first dry weekend in April, we had our first swarm call, and we saw a few swarm calls on various Facebook groups that we're members of, and we've been managing our own hives ever since, proactively managing our own hives ever since. I think we're up to 5 splits already, having given a couple away to beekeeping students and some colleagues that unfortunately lost their colonies through the winter, because that weather unfortunately also had a detrimental effect on colony losses. So it's been odd, as we say, and we're kind of asking ourselves, how many years in succession does the same pattern have to be repeated before we stop calling it abnormal weather patterns?
And at the moment, you're avoiding lightning strikes, I hear. So
Basically, at the minute, I have ignored the text message I received from Orange France telling me to disconnect my internet because the house will catch fire. So if you start to see orange flames over my shoulders, please tell me.
Right. Well, as I said, we better get started. We've got an awful lot of questions to get through, and there's more coming in. So we'll get started with the first one, which is from Paul Hancox. And Paul asks, is there a way of using a bait box or nucleus to lure only honeybees, or do the bait lures only attract honeybees? I think what Paul's referring to is perhaps sort of bumblebees or other interested bees try to enter the lures. Any experience across the panel?
Well, I'll just throw a suggestion, if that's okay. We've stopped using the manufactured lures, either in the balm form or the spray. It's I don't know if it's just different in terms of how it's produced here, but it's very strong. And what we found is that if we put it in bait boxes, the bees just don't like it. In fact, nobody likes it. It's a really strong citronella candle. In fact, so what we found is more successful instead is to, I know this kind of flies in the face of our spring cleaning understanding. Excuse me, sorry. That's just typical, isn't it? It takes me from running a business.
We are live, so it's to be expected.
Yeah, my apologies, everyone. So what we tend to do is just put a frame of relatively clean but old comb inside our bait boxes, and then we don't seem to attract anything but honeybees.
Well, I have to say, sorry, there's a noise in the background here as well. I'm totally forgotten what I was going to say, but I have heard that rumour as well, that, you know, to put an old comb in there will attract, and I've never been aware of anything other than honeybee being attracted to an hive or a newt that's put in place. The other thing that I have come across talking to someone who actually he uses it really as a feed, but he puts 3 things into a gallon of syrup, and I think what he does as well, he makes up like a paste with some wax with 3 things on it, excuse me, then rubs it into the bark of a tree, and it's got such a lovely smell. It apparently attracts the bees to it, and he puts tea tree oil, thymol, and the third one is the one, tea tree oil, thymol.
Lemongrass?
Sorry?
Lemongrass?
Yes, lemongrass. He mixes the 3 together and actually puts that on some wax, and as I say, rubs it onto wherever he wants it to be. And that is such a lovely smell. Apparently that attracts colonies quite a bit. He gets quite a few swarms. So that may be of use.
But you know what, we couldn't have worked that out better, because that almost addresses 2 other questions as well, which Ricky and Ellie have asked. Ellie has asked us, have you used lemongrass oil to attract a swarm to a bait hive? And can you suggest any other attractants other than the ones you can buy? I know, as most of you know, I like to experiment with my beekeeping, and I've read on the internet that you can use a mashed up old queen in some isopropanol alcohol. So I've got a little pot on the side of the room over there, which I'm going to try this year. So has anybody else got any other suggestions for attractants? Or have you tried lemongrass oil?
I've used one of the commercial products pretty successfully. But I will add one interesting thing that's not a very well-known piece of research. And although it doesn't directly answer this question, I find it very interesting that, and it was done with one of the commercial products, Vita used it with their product, and in testing it, they discovered that primary swarms would go to a branch, hang up on a branch nearby, whereas secondary swarms would be much more inclined to go to one of the bait hives in the apiary.
Yeah.
Right? So significance there being that it would seem that the primary swarms wanted to move out of the apiary, whereas the secondary swarms, the casts, were quite content to stay within the apiary. And you can draw all sorts of conclusions from that. Very interesting piece of research, I thought.
Is there sort of an optimum distance where to place your bait hives from your apiary?
Well, I think that comes back to this issue of primary and secondary swarms. So with primaries, you're going to have a hard job possibly catching them within the apiary, whereas secondary swarms are going to be quite happy within the apiary. Yeah, it's a very interesting piece of research. It was done by a Greek chap, a Greek researcher, university researcher.
I would say, actually, I would say on that basis, sorry, Rod, but a couple of times I've tried to get hold of a swarm within the apiary, and they'll go there for overnight, say. They'll actually stay in a bait hive overnight, but the following morning or following day you go back and they've gone. So that actually does rather lend itself to that sort of theory that they've only used my bait hive as a temporary thing from the branch, and that they've gone elsewhere, you know, to actually set up a new colony.
We had a call last week from a beekeeper we know who was in the process of spring cleaning some old hives and hadn't locked them away. They were just outside a shed on the to-do list to get around to, and one of her swarms had departed, and she knew that, and it was part of a strategy to let them go for pollination of local orchards, so that was okay. But she woke up one morning and phoned us and said, "But the hive for spring cleaning that I left on the floor outside my back door is now full of bees." So that anecdotally adds some weight to that theory, Stephen, that the secondary ones wouldn't go very far, and it also actually adds some weight to when we were trying to experiment with what to use as attractants and ended up with using old comb.
Yeah.
On the subject of old comb, then that sort of ties into Ricky's question. A friend has given him some old brood frames to use as a swarm lure, and he placed it in the freezer for 2 weeks to kill off any nasties. Are there any diseases which he should be worried about that the freezing won't kill or won't sort out? Can I open that up to anyone on the panel?
I'm no expert in this, but I'm not sure it would kill much more than wax moth. And maybe I've heard that it can kill small hive beetle as well, but it certainly will not kill AFB spores. EFB, I don't know, but I think it's going to be pretty limited in what freezing is going to kill.
I suppose, especially a domestic freezer, which doesn't get down to extremes of temperature as well.
But even some things aren't going to be killed by freezing anyway.
There we are. We'll come back to you with a detailed answer on that one, Ricky, so bear with us on that. Right, we've got a question off Sue now, quite a long question. We collected a swarm 2 days ago. We took a used brood frame from another hive and scraped the swarm into a cardboard box. They are incredibly feisty. We have prepared a new hive for them and intend to transfer them on Thursday. How can we calm them down beforehand? In my experience, every swarm that I've ever dealt with has been very docile. So.
I would agree with that, Rodri. I can only remember one swarm that wasn't docile, and it stung me quite a few times, which made sure that forevermore I wore a veil when I went to collect a swarm. And I suspect it was an absconding colony rather than a swarm. But I think absconding colonies are much more likely towards the end of the year.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, that's my only experience of a nasty swarming colony, and I didn't like it. But it did teach me a very good lesson. Never assume that the swarm is going to be a gentle beast.
I think people get quite placid when they see a swarm and they think about swarm collection. So it's good advice, that is. Yeah.
Yeah. Our experience here is a little different in that we're in France, we're still very lucky in that there's a significant number of wild bee colonies and a significant number of kept indigenous European black bee colonies. And they are less docile and less gentle, if I could put it that way, but in nature. And I haven't gone anywhere near a swarm here in France, other than the very first one, which taught me the lesson, without a veil on. And that just seems to be standard. What we do to, if it helps, to calm them down is a few things, actually, and this is born out of our experience, plus talking to our fellow beekeepers here, is a few things, and I hope they're helpful. One is minimize the amount of time between the collection and the rehoming, and just basically stages of mucking them about. It seems to be that the quicker you can get them settled into their new home, the happier they are and the calmer they will be. Secondly, we know lots of people who have given up altogether with shook swarm techniques. So basically trying to brush, scrape, or otherwise force bees out of the box you've got them in into the box you want them to be in. And we, I'll put my hand up and say we've given up with that as well. So what we try to do is persevere with marching the bees in. So that might mean a significant amount of smoking in the container or around the container where they are, given they've got a frame. I think the person that asked the question said they had a frame in there already. If that frame has some stores on it, smoking shouldn't lead them to abscond. It should lead them, if that frame has some stores on it, to actually start to gorge. And at that point, try and find the queen, get the queen into the new permanent home, and then turn the box out on a white blanket in front of the new home, white sheet and a ramp up into the new hive, and the queen's pheromone would hopefully come out, and the rest of the bees will march in. If you ever get a few minutes, have a look on YouTube and find videos of marching bees into their new home. And it's a great thing to see. Once they actually scent that queen, the entire swarm cluster will march themselves up a ramp along a white blanket and into the new hive. So that's what we do.
Behavior, especially if you can spot the queen and see her going into the.
Oh yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Amazing.
There's a lovely picture of a marching swarm in the current issue of Beecraft in the news section, so you can see it there. But Kevin, perhaps we should make it clear to some beginner beekeepers who may be watching what we mean by an absconding swarm, an absconding colony. Swarming is when they split. It's when they're creating a new colony. Absconding is when a complete colony, for whatever reason, moves home. And sometimes it might be moving home because it has maybe overridden by mites, or there's something about that home it doesn't like. So basically an absconding colony can be a bit grumpy because it's having to move home for some circumstance that we don't understand.
Yeah, quite right. And hopefully they're as rare in reality as they are in the textbooks as well. Because it generally means that from experience that there's a problem.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that answers your question, Sue, and do let us know how the feisty swarm behaves in the end. Right, we've got a question now from Mark Riches. And Mark has asked us, once you have hived a swarm of unknown origin, it is quite good practice to treat for varroa. But at what point would you do this, as sometimes a swarm can abscond? And could a varroa treatment exacerbate this? And which product should be used? There's a few questions in there. I know before the Hangout started, myself and Stephen were talking about, do you treat a swarm for varroa? I do personally, and I use oxalic acid trickling. Stephen doesn't. So what's your experience, Kevin and Wendy?
I'll go on, Kevin, after you.
We do treat for varroa. We just put we use Apiguard to treat the swarms that we collect, but just the first 14-day treatment rather than the full month, because obviously being a swarm, there is no brood to have to treat, so it's just the adult bees. And we haven't found any absconding behaviour and haven't heard of of swarms absconding just because they're being treated. I know we tend to treat with a lighter weight treatment using the thiamol-based Apiguard. I don't trust myself with oxalic acid trickling, to be honest, Rod. So maybe you can share with me your steadier hand technique later on in the year.
Right, and I have to say that we have never treated swarms, but it is an ideal opportunity to do it, obviously, because there's nothing else in the hive other than them. Excuse me.
I think it's one of those topics where beekeepers have a difference of opinion, and everyone does something slightly different, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an ideal opportunity to treat for Varroa, I've got to say. And during the summer months, we would use thymol, a thymol mix on a piece of garden. My brain's gone tonight, sorry folks. Oasis, that's it, the green Oasis. And we sometimes use that to treat during the season. But I think we had talked about it for this year. If we do get any swarms, that we probably would treat with oxalic acid dribbling, the same as you, Rod.
Yeah, I should add, Rodri, that generally I don't treat a swarm, but I would be inspecting it very carefully. And if I had the slightest suspicion that there was a load of Varroa there, I would certainly treat. I'm in an area which is relatively remote from other beekeepers, so I think that's part of the reason I usually have fairly light Varroa loads.
Yeah.
But if I was in an urban area, I might well have a different attitude.
It's amazing the difference in how beekeeping practices vary in regions and between different beekeepers. Right, we've got another question from Fran. Fran has asked us, she's recently carried out a Bailey comb change and was therefore surprised when the bee in the colony was found to have swarmed. What were the risks? Anyone like to have a stab at that question?
Was the last bit, what were the reasons?
What were the risks?
The risks, sorry.
I would have thought small. It was unusual, but I really don't know.
And she's added, she's checked for swarm cells at the appropriate times and ended up requeening it. Can you imagine how cross she was when the queen seems to have disappeared and she wants to know what did she do wrong? Perhaps, Fran, if you're watching us live now, you could send some more information, a little more detail, so we can sort of tease that out of the
Can we wind that one back, Robbie? Did she see queen cells before she did the Bailey comb change?
It's not clear. She said, I checked for swarm cells at the appropriate times and ended up requeening it.
I think there's something else going on there that we're not quite sure about.
Yeah. I would agree. We've done Bailey comb changes, Bailey frame changes on 2 of our hives this spring. Just it came round to the right rotation. And what we found, because of the weather we were mentioning earlier on, is that whilst we were giving them a beautiful new home and a huge amount of space, none of it managed to cancel out the swarming instinct. So we were in there and inspecting for queen cells far more frequently than we would normally have been if you were following the Bailey comb change steps as set out in various places. So all we did was realise what was happening in the first one, and then were far more proactive with the second one.
Would anyone like to give a stab at explaining the Bailey comb change?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I've no idea. Never done it.
Or me. That's why I asked the question.
I couldn't tell you the steps from memory, because every year that we do it, I have to go back to my Haynes workshop manual page, or whatever it is, because it's got the dozen steps in it. But the principle, for those that don't know, is that basically you're persuading your bees to move brood boxes from one that is full of old and very, very used comb and potentially has the risk of carrying pathogens and disease, up into a nice new brood box with nice new comb on there, and you are going to try and feed them with the sugar syrup to encourage the workers to draw out comb as much as possible, and then at a certain point, somewhere between step 6 and 7, 6 and 9, whatever it is, you're inserting a queen excluder to hopefully have proactively moved your queen into that new box once there is comb for her to lay in. And then theory goes that the rest of the bees move up. You insert a new entrance, and over about 4 or 5 weeks, they've all moved, in theory.
In theory.
Well, that's quite interesting, because we occasionally have brood and a half or double brood to go into the winter, and we tend to reduce the number of frames down from 10 to 8 in the bottom box, or probably in both boxes. And basically over the winter, the bees will move up, and it gives you the opportunity then in the spring to actually remove the bottom brood box, because they've all pretty much moved up into the top brood box. So you can actually do a complete change, if you like, over winter, and so they can have decent comb to start in the spring.
Just this weekend, Rodri, I received a potential article for Beecraft, which I think we're going to put in the July issue, which relates to this and is very interesting. It's so interesting, it's a technique I'm going to adopt myself next year. So that's a bit of a promo for the July Beecraft.
Excellent, excellent. There's one for the viewers to look out for then.
Yep.
Right, we've got another question off Andrew Moody. And Andrew's asked us, he said he's been fortunate to actually witness a swarm from one of his hives. While a swarm is happening, are there any measures that can be undertaken to reduce bee loss? Once they swarm, I think it's a bit late. But, he's provided a bit of context. He said swarming due to space issues. It's a poly hive, and it's a 14 by 12 brood, which is very strong. It had been manipulated by an artificial swarm in the beginning of May, and it has 2 full supers.
I do have a genuine answer for that one, and that's get into some athletic training, because a swarm will always move just that bit faster than you can run. And so that's all I can suggest to him.
Anybody else got any advice?
No idea really.
It's well, we know what one of the triggers for swarming is space, and another is just that instinct to propagate the species at colony level. And so the other triggers for swarming include the fact that there's fantastic forage in and around the area, that the weather is actually right, that the colony is happy and healthy. So all things actually that the beekeeper should be patting themselves on the back for, not necessarily beating themselves up for. So if all those other things are going well because of the care being offered by the person that asked the question, then there is always a chance at the right time of the year the bees will swarm no matter how much space you give them, just because they can't really break that habit until they're satisfied that they have swarmed.
I suppose it depends on the characteristic of the bee as well. You know, some bees have a more swarmy nature, don't they?
Yeah, anyone we keep.
As an aside from that question, actually, you mentioned giving plenty of room. I tried to do that. I tried to super up quite early in the spring to allow them that additional room. But I find that the bees have a chimneying behavior then. So, do you find that as well? Which then leads me to have to manipulate the supers and reduce the amount of space, you know. So.
Yeah, I have to say, last year because of various reasons, we weren't able to do that much with our bees. But the previous year, we've always found that we've given them masses and masses of, or plenty of space. But then we've ended up with a lot of uncapped honey or uncapped nectar at the end of the season. And last year, for various reasons, we decided we definitely weren't going to do that. We would run the risk that they would get too packed and that they would swarm. And actually, we did have 2 swarms last year, but that was all out of 20 or 30 hives that we were operating at the time. And so I've totally lost the thread of what I was saying again. But it actually seemed to work very well last year. And the only hive that we were aware was ours that swarmed actually had plenty of space. So the fact that they had plenty of space didn't actually stop them from swarming anyway. So I think there's an argument for not giving them too much space. It's getting the balance right, isn't it, between them being overcrowded, and so that enhances the swarming instinct because there's too many bees, and hitting that balance that, you know, they don't have too much space.
I suppose it's back to that Goldilocks principle of getting it just right.
Yes.
And since we really don't know why bees swarm in the first place, or at least what triggers it, there we go. I've been speaking to a couple of researchers recently, and both of them would dearly love to know what really is going on with swarming. We've all seen this for so long, and yet it's so little understood.
Yeah.
Mm.
Right, we've got to move on to our next question from Grant. Grant has asked 2 questions, actually. If you find a swarm and relocate in a hive to your apiary, should you seal the bees in for a period of time? So if you collect the swarm and relocate it into a hive in your apiary, should you seal that entrance for any length of time? Would anyone like to give that one a stab?
I think we would generally leave them shut in for 24 hours, because after that time they're supposed to have basically forgotten where they've come from, and will reorientate themselves around the new location.
It's not something I've ever done, to be honest. I've never sealed a swarm in.
No, nor have I, Roderick. I think that a swarm operates in a way that it understands that it's moving and will orientate to its new location anyway. I've never bothered sealing them in. And in any case, if they don't want to stay with me, I don't want them to stay with me either. So they can go. But none have ever disappeared on me.
For us, if we tend to operate the metric version of the 2 yards, 2 miles rule for moving swarms. So for us, it's 3 meters or 3 kilometers. And so if we are collecting a swarm that's very, very close by, we might put an entrance reducer, an entrance excluder, sorry, into the hive just overnight. So we'll bring them back here typically at dusk time with an entrance reducer, and then open them up first thing in the morning. But if we've driven any distance to actually go and collect them, then no, the only time we put an entrance excluder in is purely so that they can go in the back of the car and don't fly around and kill anyone on the drive home, and then bring them out and then open them up as soon as they get back. Because as Wendy's already said, the imprinting that they do on a location is already broken.
I suppose, well, if you seal the bees in for a period of time, there's potential that they could overheat. Is that right? You know, if they can't ventilate the box that they're in.
By that time, Roger, we tended to collect swarms actually in a polystyrene nuke, because that way you can use it as a box. They're actually already in there instead of using a cardboard box, and just leave it open underneath or in its location overnight, so that any stragglers might go in, and then go to pick it up the following morning. Having said that, we've done that twice and actually found they've absconded anyway. They've carried on. So I don't know whether it's they just don't like the polystyrene nuke. We had more success when we used cardboard boxes, to be fair.
Right, we'll go to Grant's second question, because I found this quite interesting, actually. We have had 4 swarms over the last 3 years on the branches of a monkey puzzle tree. Is there something special about monkey puzzle trees? And if not, what's the explanation? The tree is 20 yards from our hive, but the last swarm wasn't ours. We've actually got a magnolia tree in the garden, which tends to attract swarms on a particular branch.
I think there's just something very special about her monkey puzzle tree.
Yeah.
And that's the fact that bees have been swarming on it already and have left the pheromones, left various scents behind that have made the branch very attractive. I've even seen, quite frequently, I've seen remnants of comb left where bees have hung up for a period of time. So that just shows that although we can't smell the pheromones, sometimes you can actually see the physical evidence that bees have liked that spot and that they will reuse that spot because of the pheromones that are still hanging around.
How long do the pheromones last once they're on a tree? You know, do they degrade after a while?
I think you have to ask a bee.
Yeah, very true. Right, our next question is from Esther, and it's asked, my only colony on a brood and half died early in the spring, I think from isolation starvation. There were spores in the top part of the hive and also uneaten fondant on the frames. Can I give my newly acquired swarm the leftover stores, or should I destroy them? I suppose this is a bit of a disease management issue, isn't it? Something you'd like to have a go?
From our perspective, I think we would, unless you are certain of the reasons why the previous colony died, which is a lot tougher to actually get to the bottom of these days. We personally would err on the side of caution, and we wouldn't refeed until we could be happy that we weren't passing anything on to the new colony.
I would agree with Kevin on that entirely. It's better to err on the side of caution. If any whisper of disease, you just don't want to keep it.
Yeah. We've got a question which has just come in actually from Graham, and Graham has asked us, there aren't many flying drones around. Is that an indication that swarming is delayed? I know in South Wales, things are delayed by about 4 to 6 weeks. There are still very few drones around. Mm. Is that the case in anyone's experience?
Yeah, it'll be interesting what Kevin says, but in this area, certainly drones were very late this year, very late in appearing. And I suspect that's all related to why swarming has been so little in this particular area, because the bees aren't going to want to swarm if there aren't too many drones around, because they know that any queens they make are not going to be ready for mating. There aren't going to be the drones around to mate them. So yes, I think it's all linked. I'm quite sure the bees are very conscious of drones. The presence of drones indicates a colony that's got a surplus. As soon as things get tight, they will throw out a few drones, or they'll tear down a few drones. So yeah, I think it's all linked. Kevin, what's been the state in France this year in terms of the production of drones?
It's been completely aligned to the weather patterns. What we see is that the weather is one of the core triggers for when swarming behavior actually starts, and when colonies start to think about reproducing and therefore producing drones. So in our part of France, we had quite a wet February, as I mentioned. So things were quite quiet. And then we had an absolutely stunning several weeks in May, and everything went gangbusters in terms of colony growth and development. And then the rain arrived and some colder weather arrived for another 2 or 3 weeks. So that left us at the start of May opening up hives with drones in there as big as I've ever seen. So I think the positive weather signaled all of the reproductive swarming instinct. They started to make drones, and then basically once they were there, they had nothing else to do in the colony but get fed. And so we started to inspect them again, and there were some monsters in there, absolute monsters. I feel sorry for any virgin queens, to be fair.
Do you think there should be a sugar tax?
Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, well, either that or they're all emerging with type 2 diabetes from all of the feeding up that they're getting. But we do have plenty of drones right now.
Right. So, sorry, the questions are coming in thick and fast at the moment. It's hard to keep track of them all. Paul has asked a question. He's a new beekeeper this year, and he's set up a bait hive after seeing a swarm pass by. He's put some frames with foundation into a polynuke with some pheromone, but after doing research, he understands bees prefer an open cavity rather than a filled box, and apparently they don't like open mesh floors. He wonders if it's best to change it and use strips of foundation and to cover the open mesh floor. He's interested in the views of the panel. difficult one, isn't it?
I would refer the right honourable gentleman to Tom Seeley's work on swarms.
Yes.
Just going to say that.
And of course the unpredictability of what swarms want anyway. But Tom Seeley has done, an American researcher, has done some fantastic work on the locations that bees actually prefer. So I'd really recommend reading his books, and he's very readable.
Excellent. Hope that answers your question, Paul. Right. We've got a question of Ken as well. He's just taken over 3 hives and found queen excluders on the bottom, stopping the queen getting out. He's now removed them, but is there anything else he should do? The tricky
That's
one.
a tricky one, because if someone has been putting queen excluders underneath the brood box, you then wonder what else they've been doing, because it's not a usual practice. It's usually an emergency practice to try to stop a queen escaping, but I certainly wouldn't do that for more than a few days, otherwise the bees might get a bit grumpy. But I'd want to know what else those inherited hives would have in them that was unusual.
It's a technique I use sometimes to trap a swarm in a hive. Does anybody else use queen excluders for that purpose?
No, I've heard a lot of people do that though, but once again, only in association with swarms, and only on a temporary basis until you feel that they're settled, and then they're removed, and the colony just is as normal.
It's, just as an aside, a beekeeper in this village did precisely that this year. There was a swarm threatening, split the colony, put a queen excluder underneath the remaining queen with the rest of the flying bees, and for 2 successive days at around midday there was a bit of a riot in front of the hive, and on the 3rd day there wasn't. And when we looked in the hive, the queen had gone, and I think somehow she had actually slimmed down to actually squeeze through the queen excluder and escape on the 3rd day. So, you know, bees will be bees. Yeah.
Well, of course, the queen does always slim down for several days before actually going off with the swarm, doesn't she? So, you know, that could be quite understandable.
But to slim down to get through a queen excluder is determination.
Well, some have the determination to lose weight and others don't, you know.
We've got a lovely long question here now from Marcel. He's captured 2 swarms last week and hived them in a commercial hive. He's been feeding them 1-to-1 sugar syrup, and after 24 hours, he's left them alone. 3 days later, he's noticed pollen being brought back by the bees, and he's asked, should he have fed them at all, and how long should he carry on feeding? And also, when should he carry out the first inspection? He's read some literature and they suggest sort of different time scales, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, or his mentor suggested 1 week. Would anyone like to give that a go? Kevin?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of points in there in terms of how, I'll take the obvious one in reverse order. How frequently should you open them up to have a look? We would tend to observe a recently rehomed swarm, at least externally, every day, and just look for what we're expecting to see, mostly because of the crazy weather around here, because we have personal experience last year, and we know an awful lot of people that have rehomed swarms, and the literature says leave them alone for a fortnight, 3 weeks, and lo and behold, that's enough time to make 2 queen cells. And if they are strong and the forage is good and everything is, that instinct has not been assuaged by just swarming them once. So we now inspect visually as frequently as we can externally, and then we will not leave it any longer than 7 days to actually open, as long as the weather is okay, and actually inspect. But all we're inspecting for, though, is if we can see a queen, great. But what we're really looking for is to prevent more queen cells being created, to stop them from swarming again. In terms of feeding, we do feed for typically a couple of days, 3 days, but that's usually enough just to give them the wax builders, the hive builders, a head start on extruding that comb. That seems to be enough here. But fortunately, and I don't know if this is true of all types of bee, but the bees we have here are more like cats than they are dogs. They don't continue to eat just because it's there. They'll only take what they want. So after 3-4 days, they stop actually appearing. We use round feeders, so they have the transparent cups on the top. And the point at which you see no more bees there, but you can still see foragers coming back. You know they don't want it anymore. So we take it off.
I personally don't feed swarms. No, I never have, to be honest. I suppose that's a difference in beekeeping style again, isn't it?
Well, I wonder if a lot of it comes from the fact that in UK national hives are quite a bit smaller than the Dedan, which is very popular in France. So it's 500 millimeters by 425 for anybody that doesn't know. So they're bigger than a UK commercial, and that's the standard Dedan size. So drawing out one of those frames of wax, the foundation, takes a little bit more energy. So we again err on the side of caution and just give them a little bit of a leg up.
I tend not to feed a swarm except if the weather turns.
Yeah.
Normally a swarm will come out in good weather and there'll be some forage around and I'll let them get on with it. But if the weather were to close in the next day or two, then I would certainly think about feeding.
Am I right in thinking that if you delay feeding, they use their honey stores as well to draw out the wax and therefore trapping any disease or anything in the comb, then, isn't it?
Yep, that's certainly what they say.
Right, Marcel has extended his question slightly, and it's been suggested that a swarm must be requeened. Is this the recommended procedure, and what makes a beekeeper decide to requeen a swarm? Would anyone like to give that one a try? I suppose it's that question of the feisty bees earlier, isn't it?
It does really. I mean, it a lot depends on the nature, and I think you've got to I would give a swarm the opportunity, because I'm a great believer in giving all colonies, even tiny ones, the opportunity to develop and to actually find out whether she's a good queen or not, and then make a decision on that basis. I think it would also depend if they were, if they did set up, as Kevin was saying, if they start to build more queen cells, because if that's the case, then she must tend to be a swarmy queen, in which case that's something that I wouldn't particularly want, and I might think about requeening her later on in the season.
We've got a question from Keith, and Keith has asked us, will a new swarm produce honey this year?
Yeah, a swarm in May is worth a load of hay. A swarm in June is worth a silver spoon, and a swarm in July isn't worth a fly. So, yes, I think depending on when they actually swarm, you are quite likely to, because they seem to work like crazy, actually. If you do have a swarm, they seem to work harder than necessarily some colonies that I've had.
I do find swarms produce very good cut comb honey. I don't know why, but that's my experience. Whether they're in a sort of wax building mode still, and that.
Do you in that case, do you just put starter strips in the hive for them, Rod, or do you put in full sheets of foundation?
Depends how much foundation I've got left in my storage.
That's fair enough.
That's an honest answer.
If I'm running short, I cut it in half. So yeah. There's a question from Janet. I'm sure this one will inspire some debate. At what stage would you consider the need to perform a split when you suspect swarming? If there are lots of populated queen cells, then she says yes, you would need to intervene. But would you do this if there was a single queen cup that contained an egg, or somewhere in between? So at what stage would you consider the need to perform a split? What would you be looking for in terms of the colony?
I'd be looking for numbers to start with. And and the egg laying pattern, if the current queen's still laying eggs very well, whether it's a supersedure or whether it's a swarm cell. You can't really tell that to start off with, can you?
Yeah.
So I would say somewhere in between. I think I'd wait beyond just seeing an egg in a queen cup.
I wish my bees would give me the choice of one swarm cell or none. I usually just get, it's either none or, oh, look, there's quite a few swarm cells going on there. I need to do something. If it was one swarm cell, I would be extremely interested to see what was going on, and might be tempted to split because I might think I've got a supersedure queen on my hands. But this is all fantasy beekeeping as far as I'm concerned. I'm afraid I have quite determinedly swarmy bees, which are fine. I can manage them, but I have to keep on my toes.
Yeah, and I think that links into perhaps how I might answer the question is to move yourself back a little bit in time, and as a keeper of bees, insofar as we can be, try and get on the front foot, be proactive. What do you want as the beekeeper to do with your apiary? Do you want more colonies? Do you want to split for more hives, for more honey, whatever your motivations are? And if so, well, that should actually have some input into what kind of intervention you do. Natural beekeepers, for example, will typically let swarms go, and for natural reasons and the growth of the wilder population, and that's fine if that's your philosophy. We suffered, we weren't too bad by local accounts, but an awful lot of beekeepers here in France suffered catastrophic losses over the winter. So the sight of that first queen cell, they've been ready and waiting for a month, because what they want is more colonies. So their intervention at the first one it comes alongside a small celebration and a large amount of red wine, because it means there's still going to be beekeepers. So to the person that posed the question, what do you want before, and maybe think about that before you plan a route of action or what is it that you want to do.
I think that's good advice. Yeah.
And I would also add that I've seen colonies back out, having put an egg in a queen cell, and then the weather turns, and then the colony changes its mind. But I don't often see my bees change their mind if they've actually created a queen cell and started feeding it, and the larvae started to produce. Once that started to happen, I think they're on the way.
Yeah, and best piece of advice our mentor gave us years ago was, once you start to see queen cells being made, all you're doing is delaying the inevitable. Breaking down queen cells gives you the opportunity to plan for the eventuality of a swarm. It doesn't actually enable you to stop one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, I think we've got time for one last question. Not a swarm question, but we'll throw a curveball in there. So, from Martin, and Martin's asked, despite the cold winter, he's been left with a number of frames full of winter stores from various hives, certainly fed from sugar syrup. What should he do with these? And this leads into the question then, can you overfeed your bees in the autumn? Would you like to give that one a go, Kevin? We'll work across the panel.
Okay. We have been known in lean times to take nectar and honey store frames, uncap and heat through basically, and then use it as diluted feed when we've been absolutely stuck and we've needed emergency measures. Because for me, it's back to the same question about whether we offer combs and we're not quite so sure whether they'll be disease-free. The first thing we ask ourselves is, why does the colony that has effectively donated those stored frames not need them anymore? What happened to those bees? If we're comfortable with the reason, then we're more likely to reuse the stores for feed for other bees. If we are in doubt, then we don't use it at all, unfortunately. What we have been known to do actually is if it's nice weather, we've found that the bees are quite good judges of reusable food. So we have left combs out in the open, and the bees will land on it. And we've observed our bees, if it's good, they'll take it, they'll recycle it. If it's not, they'll leave it alone.
And yourself, Stephen, do you think it's possible to overfeed the bees in the autumn?
I hesitate to say this because people will start throwing, I don't know, throwing brood boxes at me, but I don't feed in the autumn.
Oh.
I use Langstroths, and I haven't fed this century in the autumn. They get enough. The ivy flow all the century has been strong enough to boost up any stores. Occasionally, I've switched a frame of stores from one colony to another before winter starts. But actually, I haven't bought sugar to feed bees except for a little bit of spring feeding. If in an emergency, if spring has been delayed and one colony just hasn't got enough stores, then I'll do a quick emergency feed. So it's not a problem I face, but I'm in the south of England, and I realise that is, it's in British terms, that's a very comfortable beekeeping environment. Not everybody has that luxury of not needing to feed. So I just regard myself as really lucky in that score.
Yeah.
Is that the same? Sorry, I might ask a follow-up question, Stephen. Is that the same even if you harvest completely, or do you typically leave them with some stores in a super, or do you empty them out during harvest?
No, I will not leave them with a super, because when the Varroa treatment goes on, the supers come off, and hardly ever do they go back on. If there is a colony that's a little bit light, yes, I might put on a colony sometime, a super, half-empty super or whatever. I might put it back on during the winter, but that is really quite rare.
Yeah.
The Langstroth brood box seems to be able to hold sufficient to get my bees through. Now, I'm really cautious in realizing that not everybody will be as lucky as that. First of all, I think it's the bees I've got, which are just mongrels, good old Hampshire mongrels. Secondly, it's the location of the apiaries and the shelter that they're in. And thirdly, it's the general weather in the south of England. So I'm not putting it down to any skill on my part. I'm putting it down to the environment and the bees that I have. That's the way it can work. And it's been a blessing, because I always hated feeding. And then suddenly I realized I didn't have to feed. So that was a bonus.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've reached the end for tonight. We've still got lots of questions coming in. And what we'll do, we'll ask the panel after the event, and we'll provide some answers directly to people who've asked questions. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been very interesting. And we'll see you next month, where Kevin will be joining us again, hopefully. So bye from me.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.